Hello. In this video, we are going to be talking about emotions. More specifically, we are going to cover types of emotions, irrational thinking when dealing with emotions, and managing emotions. So let's start with types of emotions. Generally, your emotions will fall into two categories, and these are based really on the impact of the emotion. So, facilitative emotions are emotions that basically lead to a positive or beneficial outcome. Debilitative emotions, of course, are the reverse. So this is an emotion that leads to a negative outcome. And now another factor that you have at play here is something called emotional intelligence, which is basically your ability to read and to respond to emotions effectively, right, in a positive way. So this could be understanding your own emotions, but also understanding the emotions going on of those around you and then responding to them effectively. Now, when I said you can put emotions into these two broad categories based on their impact, what this really is kind of telling you is that emotions are really malleable. They can, meaning, depending on how they're used, their impact can really change, right? So if you think of emotions, you've got all of the emotions in the world, right? So you've just got a couple of examples here. You've got anger, you've got resentment, in terms of like what are traditionally considered more debilitative or negative emotions, right? You've got joy, you've got drive, you've got ambitions, you have love, like you name the emotion, right? My point here is just to say that so you have all of these emotions that some of them you could traditionally think of, well, clearly those are bad, clearly those are negative things, and then other emotions where you can say, well, clearly those are positive, they always lead to positive beneficial outcomes. And what I'm basically trying to start off by saying is that's not necessarily true, that a given emotion is inherently good or inherently bad. In other words, always facilitative or always debilitative, right? You kind of have to think outside that box. So when I say they're malleable, it means really, if you think about it, any emotion can be facilitative or debilitative. Okay. So again, facilitative is leads to a positive outcome and debilitative, negative outcome. So let's take anger. Let's take anger. Anger can oftentimes lead to a negative outcome, right? It's easy to see how anger can be debilitative. But can anger also lead people to do good things? Can it drive people? Can it motivate people? It can, right? Happens all the time. There's all kinds of stories in life where people have reached great achievements or done all kinds of extraordinary things because they were driven by a negative event, by something that made them angry or sadness or something like that, right? Now, what's the difference? It's how they use that anger, right? Obviously, there's also many times, and unfortunately, probably more examples of how anger is used in a negative way, right? It's debilitative. How people react to the anger, um, they react in a negative way, and it's debilitative. But it can be facilitative. Now, let's take the other side of that coin. Let's take love, for example. Now, love, um, typically, right, would be a facilitative emotion, right? Makes people happy, brings great joy into your life, and all these sorts of things. But have mistakes been made or bad wrong decisions, poor decisions, right, with awful outcomes? Has that ever happened in the name of love? Of course it has, right? All kinds of things have happened in the name of love, right? We talk, in my field, I'm an attorney, but if you think of like criminal law, for example, they'll talk about, when it comes to like murder, for example, right? What are the common motives of murder? Well, oftentimes money is a major motivator. You know what else is another major motivator? Love, right? A love triangle, a spurn lover, something like that, right? Now that's obviously a really extreme example of how love can lead to a negative thing. But if you want like a more simplistic example, it would be something like, do parents, because they love their children, are they ever blind? Do they sometimes not see that their children are doing something wrong or inappropriate? Or just take family members, right? Because we love our family, when our family members are doing something that they maybe shouldn't be doing, do people sometimes cover it up? Are they sometimes blind to resolve it because they just won't admit that their family member is doing something bad? I think we all know the answer to that is yes, it happens all the time. I mean, I gave that example in a previous video where like people are willing to acknowledge that there's jerks in the world, but they're never willing to acknowledge that the jerk might be in their family, right? Or maybe the jerk's them, that they need to look in the mirror, right? Now, what's going on there? They're blinded by the love, right? They're blinded because they're emotionally connected to their family member. Um, so, emotions, whether or not they're facilitative or debilitative, really kind of depends on how you react to them, right? And typically, yes, there are some emotions we typically react to in a positive way, and there's some emotions like anger that we typically react to in a negative way. But my point is, you can choose the reaction. Um, uh, and this kind of leads to something. So because any emotion can be facilitative or debilitative, obviously the really big takeaway from that is you should take the emotions you experience in your life and always try to react to them in a facilitative way, right? In a way that leads to a beneficial outcome for you. That's kind of like the first takeaway, okay? And the second takeaway is there's a bigger sort of lesson from this, which is that one of the biggest cop outs in the world that people have is they do something, they get criticized for it, and then they say, well, I was feeling the emotion. I was just angry. I was just upset. I was just jealous. I was just, you name the emotion. And then that's why I reacted that way. Okay. And I mentioned before in another video, I said you always have three decisions that you're always controlling in any given one moment, right? And that is, what are you focusing on? What are you going to do? What does it mean? And what are you going to do about it? Okay. So here's the thing about emotions. And the reason I say that's a cop out when people say those things as like excuses for their behavior is that unless you live under a rock, you are going to experience every gambit of emotion, right? All the good ones and all the bad ones. Okay. That's just part of the human experience. And sometimes you're going to experience those emotions, both those emotions, both good and bad. And obviously, the ones that usually, for most people, are negative, those are the ones you're more likely to use in a debilitative way. So we're all going to experience those, unless you're just living under a rock. If you're just going to live life as a human, that's just part of the experience. You're going to experience those. And spoiler alert, sometimes those are not going to be your fault. You're going to go through life and you're going to do nothing wrong. And you will still experience some positive things that really, just happened upon you, had nothing to do with you, but you were fortunate enough to have those experiences. But there's also going to be some negative ones, some awful ones, some atrocious things that are going to happen, and they have nothing to do with anything you did. In fact, the only reason those emotions fell upon your house, was just because you were living life. An example of that would be loss. At some point in your life, you will lose somebody close to you. Okay, you didn't do anything to make that come about. It's just going to happen. It's just going to happen. You may get divorced. There's actually lists, by the way, of the most traumatic things that happen to people. And generally research shows it's things like loss of a loved one, or it's a divorce, or things like that, right? So these things are going to happen, and sometimes, they'll be a little bit your fault, but sometimes they're going to have nothing to do with anything you did. They're just going to happen. And they will hurt you profoundly. They will affect you profoundly. I think you can make the argument that some of these things will never heal. They will just sort of be scars that you have to move forward and live with. You're going to experience those emotions because you're not living under a rock. And I don't think you should live your life under a rock. You should live your life to the fullest. But so you're going to experience these bad things. So it's a cop out when people say, well, I was just angry, so that's why I did what I did. Well, you're a human. Did you think you were going to go through your life without getting angry? Did you think you were going to go through your life without having things happen to you that could make you angry that was not your fault? Because that happens to everybody. But they don't all react doing the thing that you did that you're now getting criticized for, right? So that's why I say it's a cop out. You don't have control over every emotion you experience. What you have control of is, what are you going to do about it? How do you react? Okay? And the key is hopefully as much as you can, every emotion you experience, the big takeaway, the second takeaway here is not just being aware. Like, knowledge is only power if you use it. So the knowledge is being aware that any emotion could be facilitative or debilitative depending on how you use it. The power is when you experience emotions in your life to try as much as you can to react to them in a facilitative way, in a way that's beneficial to you, in a way that's positive. Now, sometimes that means beneficial in the long run and not in the exact moment. So I gave you some of those examples. So, like when you lose a loved one, when you experience grief or profound loss, there is some value in going through the grief. Sometimes you need to experience the pain of the grief and the loss before you can move forward. That doesn't mean that's not being facilitative. Maybe you need to go through that grieving process. Where it becomes, to keep it facilitative and not being debilitative, is you have to know when you have to move forward from the grieving, right, to move forward in a positive way. Like, we all know there's sometimes people that stay in that grief too long and they never come out of it, right? Or they stay in the grief so deep and too long that it starts to really negatively impact their life in a way that is not just, it's just not healthy for them, right? It's hurting them, it's hurting the people that care about them, and all these sorts of things, right? Negative things down the road. So it doesn't mean, when I say facilitative, sometimes for certain situations, it just means in the long run, right? Sometimes you need to experience the pain of something. You lose a loved one, you go through a divorce or a breakup, or you name the emotional event. Sometimes you do need to experience the pain of it, and then you move forward when you're ready. I think the key is just moving forward when you're ready. And sometimes the facilitative thing to do is to experience the pain because you need to do that. You need to grieve, right? Or maybe an easier example would be just like anger, right? So instead of letting anger then be a cop-out excuse to do things that you're going to have to apologize for later, or that makes you look bad, is to use that anger to motivate you in a positive way, right? And so the way to make the knowledge in this case that all emotions can be facilitative, debilitative, depending on how you react to them, the way to make that powerful is the way to make that knowledge powerful is to learn to react to your emotions in a facilitative way. And I've actually seen people talk about this in terms of research into communication. I've seen people talk about this a lot more lately in a business context, where like really successful CEOs and leaders of just really successful companies talking about, learning to manage their emotions in a facilitative way, right? Like always looking at a situation in how can I react to this positively? I think I've mentioned before in another video about how this notion of, like, I believe, just my opinion, that every situation has leverage. And what I mean by that is something positive you can take from the situation. So the leverage, like, that you can get out of it. So it's sort of like, if you lose a job, what's the leverage? Well, the leverage might be you have more free time now to try to maybe explore, do you need to do a career change? Is there something else you should be looking for in a job? Or maybe it's a chance to work on your health, but there's always leverage, right, in any situation. Or so I think emotions are kind of like that, which is you experience the emotion, and if it's not a good one, asking yourself, how can I react to this in a way that leads to some good, right? And that's what you need to do. Now, obviously, it's easier to see that when it's an emotion that naturally makes somebody happy or joyous and all that sort of stuff. But again, like the family example, you don't want to make sure that you're not blinded either, though, that you're not like taking a situation and that emotion is leading to a negative outcome because you are blinded. You're not seeing things clearly. So you have to be careful about that. An example of that would be like the halo effect. If you've ever heard of that in a psychology class, the halo effect is basically you create you meet somebody, you have a first impression, or you form a relationship and you have that first impression. And in the halo standpoint, it would be you think highly of them, or you really like them, or something like that. And we skip ahead 2 years down the road, and now they're doing all these things where you don't like them, right? All of a sudden now a bunch of bad stuff's happening, but you're still thinking in your head of them as that same person, that first impression you had, right? Of still having the halo over their head when they're no longer that person anymore, right? Or they've gone so far removed from the person you originally liked, or who you thought they were, and now who they're showing you they are is completely different. And people have sometimes a hard time of recalibrating, readjusting. Now, if you originally thought well of them and they're no longer behaving in a way that matches that impression, but you're just blind to see it, okay? that's an example of the halo effect, and an emotion of like joy or liking that someone, or if it's a romantic thing, being in love with them, leading to a debilitative outcome, right? Because it's blinding you to maybe some negative behaviors that are going on and having a negative impact on you. So try to react to your emotions in a facilitative way. That's going to be the healthiest thing. Sorry, I can't talk. The healthiest thing for you to do in your life. And if you're just going to react to things and say, well, I did that because this was the emotion, and look, we're not perfect, that's going to happen sometimes, okay? But if generally you try to control that, you want to try to control that, because ultimately, if you're going to go through life and you're going to do things that you're going to get criticized for, that are mistakes, right? And you're always going to have to be apologizing or trying to walk them back. Ultimately, you're kind of just lying to yourself. You're not being honest with yourself. Because the reality is, you don't have control over the emotions all the time that you experience. Some things are just going to happen, right? But you have always had control over how you react to them, right? And try to react to them in a facilitative way. Now, emotional intelligence, that's the ability to read the emotions of the room of other people and respond appropriately. Obviously, if you do that, you're going to have much healthier relationships and stronger relationships, because emotions are a big part of who we are. And if you can read them effectively in other people, what's really going on, and respond to them appropriately, obviously you're going to have a better communication flow, and they're going to be more comfortable around you, and the relationship's going to be healthier. But you also have to remember, like, there's again two sides of that coin. Another part of emotional intelligence is understanding your own emotions, understanding what's making you happy, what's making you sad, what's making you react a certain way. Why are you doing a certain thing? Or like, for example, let's say you have a pattern of behavior that you don't like, that you're trying to stop or you're trying to change, but you keep engaging in that pattern of behavior. Okay. So now look, there could be things that have nothing to do with your emotions as to why you're engaging in that pattern of behavior. But if there's an emotional tie to that, or an emotional trigger, one part of having self-emotional intelligence is to ask yourself, okay, what is the emotions that I'm experiencing when I do the thing? What's triggering me? What's giving me anxiety there? Or when do I experience that anxiety? Or what's making me angry so I react that way? What's making me, you name the emotion. What's making me feel lonely? What's making me feel sad? Why do I do the thing that I know I don't logically want to do, right? So part of emotional intelligence, I just want to point out, it's also trying to like be introspective, right? And be self-aware. What are my emotions? Okay. What's driving me to do the things that I do? Why do I do the things that I do? So emotional intelligence, also very important, but again, you always want to react to any emotion in a facilitative way. There's also something called emotional contagion, and this is another reason to manage emotions. And that's because you can transfer. Emotional contagion is basically just this concept. I know we've all experienced this, where you can transfer emotions to another person. So this is the classic: you meet up with a friend and they're in a bad mood, and after a few minutes, all of a sudden you're in a bad mood too, or they're snippety, so you get snippety, right? Or and also the vice versa, right? So they're happy, so you get happy. So emotional contagion is like that emotional transfer, and this can happen with people where if you're around somebody and they're having a certain emotion, it sort of catches on with you. This is part of why we sometimes are drawn to people that tend to always be upbeat, or there's certain people that have like charismatic personalities. A lot of times it's because they're upbeat, so they make us upbeat, or they're funny, which puts us in a good mood right when we're around them. So you'll see this types of things. So but if you're aware of that, what it means is you need to manage your emotions, because you just need to be aware that you could be then spreading that out to other people. So if you're constantly negative or pessimistic, you're maybe spreading that to your children, right? If you act that way around them, or if you, or just negative, or you name it, right? So you have to be careful about that. You have to just be aware that you can transfer those emotions pretty easily to other people. All right, a couple of common reasons why we tend to deal with emotions in a negative way, and it basically just kind of comes down to irrational thinking that people have. And unfortunately, in some other classes, I'll have discussions on logical fallacies and things like that. Now, look, one of the things about logical fallacies is, unfortunately, people actually think in terms of a ton of illogical fallacies. Like, we don't actually think rationally. We think we do, and we're not. I mean, it's just constant. So, and that's part of why fallacies work really well. Is some of it is just sort of the way our natural go to is a million fallacies. It's just absurd how much this works on people. Like it's because again, it's just part of some of it's part of our natural mindset. Some of it's just that people are easily fooled. Like there's a lot of different reasons for it. Some of it's we just don't realize we're doing it, right? We're not really aware what the fallacy is. But here's some common ones that deal with emotions specifically. And by engaging in these, they tend to lead to these negative, debilitative outcomes. So the fallacy of perfection. So this is basically if things aren't perfect, I'm pissed, right? I'm going to come back to these. The fallacy of overgeneralization, the fallacy of helplessness, and the fallacy of catastrophic expectations. Okay, so the fallacy of catastrophic expectations. This is basically the belief that if something can go wrong, it will. Like something bad always happens to me, right? This always doesn't work, that kind of stuff. This is very similar to the fallacy of overgeneralization. So the fallacy of catastrophic expectations is basically the worst case scenario always happens to me. The fallacy of overgeneralization is you basically make the conclusion that's way too broad. So you say this always happens every time. So it's not always the worst case scenario, but whatever scenario it is, it happens all the time, right? Now, why are these not logical or rational? Well, the first thing is it doesn't happen every time, right? I mean, literally, it does not happen every time. So that's that right off the bat, right? That's a logical fallacy. Something may happen a lot to you, but not every time. Okay, so if you start to think that way, that well, every time it doesn't work out, you're already setting yourself up to feel bad about something that just isn't a reality. Okay, it doesn't happen every time. Worst case scenario, same thing. It's not going to be the worst case scenario every time. Now, the worst case scenario happens to some of us, but usually not, right? Very rare, and a lot of times it never happens. Okay, and this can create a scenario where maybe something bad. The reason we respond to this in a debilitative way is so one way it could be something really bad or extreme, like the worst, close to the worst case scenario, does happen, and then we really wallow in it because we're like, well, see, I always get this, the worst thing always happens to me, when really it was just kind of an isolated event. The second thing is that it will stop us from doing things. So, because how many times has this ever happened to you where you're fearful of something, you're having all this anxiety, and in your head you're playing out the worst case scenario instead of so what you're doing is you're playing out the catastrophic expectation, the worst case scenario, instead of what's likely or plausible. Okay, there's a difference between what's probable and what's plausible. So the worst case scenario is plausible, meaning it could happen. But that doesn't mean it's probable. In fact, because it's the worst case scenario, it's probably not probable, meaning it's not likely. It's not going to happen most of the time. In fact, it might only happen 1% of the time. But what happens is because we're thinking about the worst case scenario, it just stops us from doing the thing. We don't put ourselves out there because we're like, well, that really bad worst case scenario could happen. And so we just don't do it. And that is just not you don't want to live your life that way because you're going to just miss opportunities in your life, right? It's like the guy who doesn't ask the girl out because he's like, well, she could laugh at me and, spit in my face and immediately start a live stream laughing at me, pointing out what a loser I am for trying to outkick my coverage, right? Ever heard the phrase outkick your coverage? That means it's when you're trying to date somebody who's like out of your league, right? By the way, maybe it's an old man phrase. I don't know. Outkick your coverage. Like, okay, you could ask the girl, like, how many times do you think that actually happens? Probably not often, right? Even if they're going to say no and they're appalled you'd even ask. Usually, most human beings have some sense of empathy and they handle it in a decent way, right? They're not going to laugh at you and start the live stream making fun of you, right? You're not going to get totally destroyed. So, living your life afraid of the worst case scenario, just, that's like saying, well, I'm not going to go outside because I could get hit by lightning. I'm not going to get in my car because statistically, one of the number one ways you're going to die is a car wreck. So I'll just never get into a car. Like, you can't live your life that way, right? But, those seem like extreme examples, but it's the same type of thinking. So, the problem with catastrophic expectations fallacy is it just stops us from doing things because they're worried about the worst case scenario. And again, it's just not likely. So you shouldn't be making decisions in your life always worried about that. Now, obviously, there's times when maybe that should be more warranted. But for the most part, you don't want to live your life that way, right? And, this kind of comes back to, there's a quote from psychology I like that's related to this, which is that fear can be a good thing, but it needs to be a counselor and not a jailer typically. And there's a difference, right? A counselor just means, excuse me, hey, this is important, proceed with caution. A jailer stops you from doing something, right? Don't let fear be a jailer all the time, where it just stops you. Let it be a counselor. This is important. Take it seriously. Pay attention to what you're doing. But it does, try to avoid the worst case scenario. But it doesn't mean don't do it. It doesn't mean don't get in your car, right? It means drive safely. So, again, naturally, that's not a productive way to think of things. Fallacy of helplessness. So this is basically the belief that, well, everything's outside of my control. I have no ability to change or alter or improve the situation, right? And like my last video was just talking about relationships, and I was talking about how people tend to not think about what are the things that I need to be to make myself attractive to the kind of person I want to meet, right? So, like, let's take that for example. Let's say somebody's single and they're not really dating the type of person they want to date, or they're not getting interest from those types of people or something like that. So on one hand, you could throw up your hands and say, well, it's just not fair, right? And I can't date the people I want to date, and it's all their fault. They're all shallow, or they're this and they're that, and I'm resentful and bitter. Or you could say, okay, I can't control who somebody else likes, right? But I can do things to put myself in a better position, right? If you're not in shape, you could get in shape. If your finances are a mess, you could get that in order, right? Like, there's other things you could do. And it's the same thing with, you can apply that to anything in life, right? You're looking for a job, so you're unemployed. Well, what are the things I can do to make myself an applicant that stands out? But there's this belief sometimes where we have a problem and it's not getting resolved, and we're like, well, I have no control over resolving this. And a lot of times that's not true. There's usually some control you have in the situation, and it's trying to do that, right? Like, it's just focus on what's productive. And even to the extent where sometimes it means focusing on something else, right? Because that's a more useful. So, for example, sometimes we have things that are going on in our life that are negative or stressful, and we actually don't have control over them, right? We have no control over any aspect. But even in that situation, okay, well, then your control is on, go back to what I said, your three choices. What are you focusing on? What does it mean? How are you going to react? What are you going to do? Well, change what you're focusing on. Maybe you need to then focus on B. If you have no control over A, maybe for right now, you need to focus on B, right? Or you need to react to B because you have no control over A. But this notion of like, I can't do anything is usually not true. The fallacy of perfection. So here, this is a common one that we actually think of, and it's just not healthy. So I'll give you an example of this. It's basically, again, it's basically somebody, they're trying to do something, or they set a goal, or they set a standard, and the minute it's not perfect, they just beat themselves up. So they react in a debilitative way because things didn't go perfect. So classic example is dieters, right? So you start a diet, it's like January 1st, and because that's when most people start diets, and you're just like, all right, nothing but, again, it's like nothing but coconut water and free range, grass fed, organic kiwi for me until I reach my goal. And I'm going to run 20 miles a day and go to the gym 3 days a week, right? Gains get girls. And until I reach my goal weight. By the way, kiwi cannot be free range and grass fed because it's not an animal. Okay, so you start the diet, and you start on Monday, and you're rocking and rolling. Then Friday, your friend's like, want to go to lunch? And you're like, I can handle it. I can go to lunch. Sure. And the next thing you know, at lunch, you've had the bloomin' onion, right? Which is just like onion rings. Um, you blow the diet at lunch. You just go crazy. You get the fajitas, just everything's going crazy there. You get out of lunch. What does the typical dieter say? Do they say, "All right, bad lunch. I'm right back on my diet right now. Tonight, another kiwi coconut water snack before bed"? Now you should do that, but the typical dieter, they go, "Well, cheat day, right? I mean, I've already blown my diet today. Okay, it'll be a cheat day." Now, and if you're not a serial dieter, let me just explain little behind the curtain here for you, uh, from somebody who's overweight. What that for a lot of dieters, what that means is they're gonna binge eat. Cheat day means I'm gonna binge eat everything I can till 11:59 p.m. Because after all, it's a cheat day. It doesn't count, right? It's fine. So they basically they then have a bad dinner. They blow the diet that day, and they get up on Saturday, and it turns out kind of hard to restart a diet after you just had a whole day of junk food. Because spoiler alert, food has various addictive properties. We know that. That's not really an opinion. You can research things, do some Googling on effects of salt, fat, and sugar in the human brain and all that sort of stuff. So it's kind of hard now to start back on the diet. And so then what do people say? Well, hey, cheat weekend. Start again on Monday, right? Now what's happened here? They were rolling along and everything, they were rolling along and everything was perfect. And the minute things weren't perfect because you had the bad lunch, they were basically like, well, screw it. And they went into 3 bad days. So they ended up with 4 days on the diet and 3 days off. And what happened there is they let perfection be the enemy of good. Another quote for you. Don't let perfection be the enemy of good. And that's exactly what happened here. Things weren't perfect. I was going at 100%. I screwed up, so screw it all. And now my effort goes down to 0 because I had 3 binge days. And the problem with that is now you will not reach your weight loss goal. Because if it turns out losing weight is hard. It turns out a lot of the things that people set goals for are hard to accomplish. If it was easy, everybody would do it. It ain't easy. And unfortunately, 4 days on the diet and 3 days off ain't good enough. Like 60% ain't good enough. Okay? But here's the thing. Just because 60% isn't good enough doesn't mean 90% wasn't good enough. Don't let perfection be the enemy of good. Guess what? For most things you want to accomplish in life, you just have to be good to get it. You don't have to be perfect. If that person had, after the bad lunch, still stayed on their diet that day, stayed on their diet Saturday and Sunday, now they've had 1 bad lunch out of 7 days. They've done the right thing, so to speak, 90% of the time. They're going to reach their goal. It wasn't the lunch that killed them. It's the fact that they let the lunch turn into 3 bad days. The fact that they beat themselves up. In other words, they had a debilitative negative reaction to I wasn't perfect. And that's what killed them. The 90%, the difference between 90% and 100% and the things you want to get in life is not whether or not you'll get there, it's how fast you get there, but you'll get there. But for a lot of us, we set the standard of perfection, we don't accomplish it, so we kill ourselves because we're humans, we're not going to be perfect. And then we let our effort go down to 10%, and then we try to be perfect again and again and again. It's not about being perfect, it's about being good. You just have to be good. That's why there's that quote, don't let perfection be the enemy of good, because good is all you need. And again, you already know this. Think about it. Somebody who's let's take the reverse. Somebody who's really in shape, they go to the gym all the time. I got, spoiler alert again, guess what? There's days they don't want to go to the gym. And there's days they don't. They've had pizza. No. They've had a piece of cake. No. They've had a burger. No. Really? Yes, they have. I swear it's true. Um, it's just that they don't normally have pizza every night. They don't normally skip going to the gym, right? They go sometimes when they don't want to, right? That's another thing, by the way, that amazes me in life. How people uh, they don't do something or they don't follow through, and then people are like, "Why didn't you?" And they're like, I just didn't feel like it, man. It wasn't fun. And it's like, who told you everything in life was going to be fun? Like, you know, sometimes you got to do things you don't love. Sometimes you're going to do things that aren't fun and that aren't boring for the greater good. Like, what part of that, I don't get it. Like, again, people are really healthy and go to the gym all the time, work out. There's times they don't want to, and they do it anyway. Sometimes you got to do the things you don't want to do because of the greater good, right? Um, you got to be willing to do that sometimes. And sometimes, by the way, it also means walking away from the most awesome thing or the best, the most fun thing or the best experience for the greater good. Like, sticking with this dieting example, here's another spoiler alert. It turns out that people who are really in shape and super healthy, right? They, just like me, Mr., out of shape guy, they agree with me. Like, if you gave me a survey and I gave them a survey, is pizza or salad, which one tastes better? I think obviously pizza tastes better. But guess what? They think pizza tastes better too. They just choose, even though it tastes better, to not have the pizza. In other words, they walk away from the thing that's better in the moment for the long term good, right? Because they know that in the end, they would rather be healthy, right? So they choose the salad. So it's like, that's another little side note. Like, people sometimes, it's amazed me how they're like, well, they always make the optimal choice for their enjoyment, and if it's not the optimal choice for their enjoyment in the moment, they're like, well, of course I didn't do this or that. And it's like, well, who told you you should always choose the optimal enjoyment choice, right? Sometimes you got to choose the other one if you want the long-term good. So sorry, hope I um didn't go too far off the tracks on that example. But the best, just to wrap that up, the classic example of this was, there's this film. It's a couple years old now. It's probably like 10 years old now, with Philip Seymour Hoffman in it, and it's this famous case actually. It's about this guy who was addicted to. He was a gambling addict, right? And it's a true story. He was working in a bank in Canada. He was a manager or something with the bank, and it's called Owning Mahoney. By the way, if anybody ever wants to watch this, again, Philip Seymour Hoffman vehicle, really good movie. And what he was doing was he was stealing from the bank, and he would fly down to Vegas and Reno and Atlantic City, and he was gambling because he was a gambling addict, right? He was spending the money, stealing from the bank, spending the money. So obviously in the end he gets arrested, he gets caught. And one of the very last scenes in the movie, he's in a counselor's office. And the counselor asks him, "So how you doing? Are you still not gambling?" And he says, "Yes." And the counselor says, "Let me ask you something. On a scale of 1 to 10, how did gambling make you feel? Like, what's the biggest high you got from gambling?" And he said something like a 12. It's like, it's beyond the 10, right? He said it's a 12. And then the counselor said, "Okay, what's the greatest high you've ever gotten from anything else in life on a 1 to 10 besides gambling?" And he said a 7, something like that, right? And then the counselor says, "Okay, how do you feel about living the rest of your life at a 7?" Right? It's the very last scene in the movie. And the point is, if he was going to give up gambling, he has to accept that I'm going to give up the 12. That it is possible that I'll never get a 12 through anything else in life that I'll ever find or ever again. But because gambling is so destructive for me, I'm going to walk away and I'm going to accept whatever the next best high is, a 7. And sometimes in life, if you really want certain things, or if you really want a certain outcome, what I'm trying to tell you is you have to be willing to accept that. The pizza will always taste better than the salad. Nothing's ever going to change that. So to use our diet example, and the people that are super healthy, right? What have they done? They have chosen to accept that, and most of the times choose the seven. I mean, there's some really good salads. I'm not trying to, not trying to throw shade at salad. There's some great salads out there. I'm near Salad Works myself. I'm pro Salad Works. Um, Need to choose them more. I choose the 12 way too much when it comes to food. But so like a little side note, by the way, is just, hey man, sometimes you got to walk away from the optimal thing, the most the most funnest, awesomest thing, because it's for the greater good, right? Um, that seems to be lost in a lot of people, right? You just see it a lot where it's like, well, that didn't make me the happiest, so I did this. And it's like, well, that doesn't still make it the right choice, man. Sometimes that's not what life's about. So you got to think about that. Now, obviously, there's again, I'm just illustrating that because hopefully that's helpful to you guys in some way, as like a cautionary tale, something to keep in mind. But and obviously, there's times you need to live for the moment and be happy. I'm not saying that that's not true either. Now, going back to this perfection be the enemy of good. So again, anything in life you want, you just got to be good. If you just make the right choice with your diet most of the time, you'll reach your goal. It's like people who are good with money. It doesn't mean people that are good with money have never spent something, never bought things frivolously, right? It doesn't mean they've never splurged or overindulged. It just means most of the time they make the right decision. So, we chase perfection, we kill ourselves, and because good isn't good enough, we need to be perfect, and then ultimately it leads to us not that debilitative reaction, not the actual thing, not the bad lunch. It's the debilitative reaction of 3 bad days that leads to us not accomplishing our goal. So chasing perfection is one of the most really common ones that we tend to think in terms of. A lot of us do it. It's very self-destructive. And by the way, a little side note, the second reason why it's self-destructive is that when you chase perfection, you're also chasing something that wouldn't make you happy anyway. Because think about it. Whatever you're trying to be perfect at, if you really had to be perfect at that for the rest of your life, would you really be happy? Like if you really spent the rest of your life with just the free range kiwi and coconut water, do you think you'd really be happy? I don't think you would. If you can never have pizza again, right? Sometimes you do got to let yourself go, right? And so it's like we're chasing this thing that wouldn't even make us happy to begin with. It's not needed. Good is usually needed. And by the way, the third reason why to not chase perfection is a lot of times it's not realistic, meaning it can't be accomplished. Sometimes it can't be accomplished because you can give your best effort, but maybe you just can't be perfect because you don't have all the necessary resources or information, right, to be perfect in a situation. So it's really unhealthy, but really common. Okay. Other types of rational thinking, fallacy approval, the belief that it's vital to gain everyone's approval, right? You're not going to please everybody all the time. I think there's like an Abraham Lincoln, I should know it, but I don't off the top of my head, quote about that. Like you're going to please some people some of the time. I don't know, something like that. He said it. It was brainy. You're not going to please everybody, right? And if you're going around trying to please everybody, make decisions that way, instead of what makes you happy, right, or what makes the people you care about happy, that can oftentimes lead to negative emotional reactions and things like that. You just can't worry about that all the time, right? You really should just focus on what makes you happy and the people you care about happy. The fallacy of should. So this is kind of like just not distinguishing the way things are and sort of the real world, right? And I mentioned this before that, there's a lot of things in life that are just simply not fair. And where the cards, the deck's kind of stacked against you sometimes in certain situations with certain things. And you can strive to change that. And, more power to you. You should strive to change the world and make it the place that it should be for you to live in and for the people you care about to live in. But in the meantime, you do have to live in the world the way it is. And in the meantime, things maybe woulda, coulda, shoulda, but they still are the way they are. And you have to proceed accordingly based on to the reality that you're in right now. And so sometimes we have these negative emotional reactions because we're caught up in the should, right? Instead of the way the reality is. So don't make that mistake. Fallacy of causation is the belief that emotions are always caused by outside forces instead of at times by our own decisions. So this is that classic where I said it's the biggest cop out, one of the biggest cop out. I mean, there's lots of cop outs, but one of the big cop outs is people, they're like, well, I did that because I was angry. I did it because I was this, and I did it because I was that. So again, even if the emotion's not your fault, somebody else walked in the room and did it to you, right, or put you in that state, you had control over your reaction, right? So even if it's caused by forces outside of you, you could have reacted in a facilitative and a positive way. And then obviously there's some emotions we're responsible for putting ourselves in that emotional state, right? We did something. And so maybe we shouldn't react that way, right? Like we should or shouldn't put ourselves in that situation. So this fallacy of causation is basically just, well, usually it's because somebody else did it, right? Or some external factor was the reason that we're in this emotional state. But it's basically just somebody else did it or something else happened, put us in the state. So then that gives us a hall pass to react however we want. And unfortunately, it seems like that's how a lot of people live their lives, maybe most people. But again, I don't think that's being intellectually honest, meaning I think you're lying to yourself, right? You're just BSing a BSer, so to speak, is the phrase. Because you still had control of how you reacted. You had control of how you reacted, right? So don't just use it as a hall pass like that, because in the end, you can tell yourself that and just do what you want to do and react in some negative way, but nothing good came out of that, right? And you might have just made the situation worse. So was lying to yourself in that situation as using it as a hall pass instead of taking control on how you react to something, was that really helpful to you? It really wasn't in the end, right? And so that is another fallacy. So just got to be careful about that. All right, managing emotions. I mentioned this before, right? I brought it up. You got a couple options. So obviously I mentioned the 3 decisions you're always making, which is, what are you going to focus on? Are you going to focus on a way to, the negative part of it, or a way to react positively? Now, again, there are some emotions where you do need to like experience the pain of something or the grief or something like that before you move forward. I'm not saying don't do that. You do need to do that sometimes. But what I'm saying is focus on what is healthy. So if the grieving part is what needs to happen, because that's the healthy thing that you need to go through, okay, fine, focus on that. But know when it's time to focus on turning the page as best you can, right? So what are you focusing on? What does it mean? And what are you going to do about it? How are you going to react? And there's also something called reappraisal, which is rethinking the meaning of an emotional event in a way that alters its evaluation or impact. So this is basically, something happens, you rethink of it in a positive way or in a different way that changes the impact of that, right? Into something more productive. Meaning, when I say productive, I just don't mean in a clinical, literal sense of helped you accomplish something. I mean, it could be that, but what I really mean is just something that's positive, right, or beneficial in your life, whatever that may be. So can you rethink of it? I gave you that example of a job loss, right? A job loss could be an opportunity to reevaluate your situation and what's going on in your career, right? A job loss could be um, an opportunity to work on your health or to spend more time with your family, right? If economics allow. So it's just like, or like I said, rethinking about what's the best job for me, or should I do a career change, or what do I want? Even if it's not a career change, like what am I looking for in the next job? So it's just rethinking something to where it's in a more productive, positive state. Okay, and sometimes that's what you want to do there. Okay, so is to reappraise the situation. Now that doesn't work with every emotion. There's some emotions like they just kind of are what they are, and you can't necessarily alter too much what's going on with that event. But it just means sometimes you can rethink of them, reimagine them, so to speak, in a different way. Other things to keep in mind about managing emotions: be self-aware of your emotions and what is responsible for them. So, be self-aware just means, what emotions am I feeling? When do I feel them? And then what's putting me in that state? What's making me agitated? What's giving me anxiety? What's making me happy? What's making me sad? What's making me all these sorts of things? What's motivating me? What tends to not motivate me, right? Recognize the difference between feeling, thinking, and talking and determine the best way to deal with an emotion. So again, same thing. Sometimes what we feel, we have the least control over, because an emotion can happen that we had no control over, right? But Where we do take control is what we think about it a lot of times. Not always, because sometimes we just have like thoughts that come into our head. They don't necessarily mean anything. And they might just be like kind of like autopilot or instinctive reactions, things like that, right? But we have some control over the thoughts, and we have some control. We obviously have total control about what we say, right? And how we act and things like that, right? So recognize that you've got these levels. There's I feel something, which I would say you have the least control over, unless you like consciously reappraise it or like reimagine it or start to focus on. Once you start to focus on different things that are more positive or productive, then you can change how you feel. But obviously, I think that one initially you have kind of mixed control over. But then you start to get some control, obviously, over how you think about it. Not 100%, but a lot of control. And then obviously you have total control over how you talk about it and the actions you take. Consider the entire communicative context when deciding with how to deal with emotions. That basically just means consider like the channel. Do I talk about this with, if I need to talk about it with somebody, do I talk about it in person or a text, right? Is this something I blurt out in social media? Like, how do you react that way? Physical environment. Do I talk about it with other people in the room? Who's in the room? That kind of stuff, right? So consider all those sorts of things. Use language that accurately reflects how you feel and what you want to do about it. So in other words, if it's something you need to talk to somebody else about, make sure you actually explain what you're feeling. Like really tell them, because they don't know. They're not inside your head, right? They can have some emotional intelligence in the situation and try to read a situation, but are you communicating? We're focusing on communication here, obviously. Are you communicating in a way that really gets across what emotions you're feeling, experiencing in that moment, right? Just make sure you accurately talk it out. And then have empathy and sympathy for others. Okay. So, and what I mean by that is basically, be emotionally sensitive to what other people are going through. And this kind of brings up something too. I just would point out is that you can decide how to live your life, but I think the most productive thing is, so you can have empathy and sympathy for somebody. It's easy to do when they're in situations that it's not their fault, right? So they're going through something that's difficult, and you can be there for them and express some sympathy and empathy. And if it's not their fault, that's easy to do, right? Because it's like, well, they're a victim, right? So it's easy to have compassion for them. But sometimes people obviously experience things that are kind of also it's kind of their fault, right? Or maybe it's 50-50 their fault. And there's people that go through life and they're like, well, it's your fault, so I have no empathy for you, or I have no sympathy for you. And what I'm suggesting to you is you can still have empathy or an understanding for people, even when it's kind of their fault, or you think it's kind of their fault. Okay. And that's probably the more productive way to go through life. It's probably going to help you out more. And in fact, when I say help you out more, is like look at it from a professional job situation. If you deal with people who are often in emotional states, it's going to be beneficial if you can learn to be emotionally sensitive towards other people, even if you think it's kind of their fault sometimes. Because otherwise, you're just going to alienate potential clients, customers, or people you can help. Classic example is my field. Look, I handle a lot of divorce and custody cases. Half the time, it's my client's fault. They're going through divorce. They don't want to get divorced, but I saw their Instagram account. They showed it to me, and it's their fault. Right? So just because it's their fault, that doesn't mean I'm like super cold to them and can't show some understanding that a divorce is difficult and a custody battle is difficult. Of course I can, right? And in fact, if I was really cold to them because, well, it's your fault, is that going to help me be an effective attorney for them? Probably not. And in fact, I'm going to probably lose some clients and customers. They're just like, I'm cold, right? So sometimes you do got to learn to have some empathy and sympathy for others, even if you think it's their fault, right? And I personally, I just think that's a better way to go through life, is to be willing to have some of that. Doesn't mean you have to have it all the time, right? You can draw a line. There's certainly things that happen to people where I don't necessarily always have empathy or sympathy for, but a lot of times I think it's usually more beneficial to solve a problem if you always have empathy and sympathy. A really good recent example of this that I saw was Bill Maher. If you know Bill Maher, he's a comedian and political commentator. He has a show on HBO called Real Time with Bill Maher. And I do not like Bill Maher, and that's not a political statement. I just do not. I do not like him. I have not liked him for many years for a variety of different reasons, not necessarily politically related. Um, but an example of one of the reasons I don't like him. Personally, I don't like him because I think he gives opinions on things that he knows nothing about constantly, and takes shots at subjects that he does not know the subject. And I think it's not fair, right? He has a big platform. That's why I don't like him. But anyway, to Bill Maher, an example of this. A couple of years ago, Bill Maher on his show was like, well, we're talking about, they were talking about obesity in America. Okay. And he said, well, the bottom line is we just need to start fat shaming people. Period. We need to just call them out as stop eating pizza, and just fat shame them and ridicule them, and that'll teach them to get thin, stop eating too much. And it created a little bit of a stir. And like, I know, for example, another fellow comedian, James Corbin, if you know him, he's kind of overweight, not insanely overweight, but overweight, was like, hey man, that's not cool. And it's like, that's an example of that. So if you take people that are overweight, and hey, I'm overweight, maybe I'm too close to the topic, but people will look at that and they'll say, well, it's their fault. They're overweight, and so if they get ridiculed or something, then they deserve it. Like, don't eat so much. Well, the problem with that is, of course, and this brings up something why I'm saying have empathy, even if you think that that they did it themselves, is you could be wrong. So in other words, there's lots of people that are overweight, and this is kind of why this bothered me with Bill Maher. There's lots of people that are overweight that has nothing to do with how much food they eat. There's people that have thyroid issues. There's people that have different illnesses and things like that. You can be anorexic and gain weight, and you're actually eating less, right? But you've screwed up your metabolism so much that it holds on to everything. Like, there are lots of there's all kinds of reasons that people are overweight that has nothing to necessarily do with choices they've made. Or maybe they're overweight because, yeah, they're eating way too much, but they're dealing with something else going on in their life that's very traumatic or something like that. So to simply just shame everybody, you're saying, well, it's your fault. And you could just literally objectively be wrong. It has nothing to do with their choices. Like I said, it could be a medical condition, could be lots of other things. You could be wrong, right? And so that's another danger with like not having empathy or sympathy for people because you think they deserve the plight, because you may not be accurate on whether or not they deserve the plight, right? So that's another reason why it's not productive. And if I gave you that example of a workplace example, where if you have to deal with clients and customers who are dealing with emotional situations, if you're going to walk around judging everybody, you're not going to be very good at your job, right? Because you're going to be dealing with people sometimes who maybe, like there's some blood on their hands, and you still got to work with them. And you're going to find it's a lot easier to work with people if you can have empathy and sympathy in almost every situation. Now, that doesn't mean that extends to every situation. There's certainly times when you can look at something and go, hey man, I don't have empathy and sympathy for you, right? Like, I'm not saying you always have to have it, but what I'm saying is it's usually better to err on the side of generosity when it comes to that in a lot of situations in life, because you could be wrong about judging whose fault it is, and usually it just makes it easier to deal with and work with people. So that concludes our discussion on emotions. I hope it was helpful. And I will see you guys hopefully in the next video.